The sea had begun to change its character. For many days, the Atlantic stretched in every direction, without interruption, a vast and patient field of water, where the horizon encircled the ship in quiet symmetry. The swells had moved with a long and deliberate rhythm, rising slowly beneath the hull of Evening Star before passing gently astern. But now the navigator could feel that the water beneath the vessel had taken on a different voice. The swells no longer moved in the steady procession of the open Atlantic. Instead, the sea carried the quiet conversation of several distant currents meeting beneath the surface. The motion of the ship was softer, almost wandering, as if the ocean itself were exploring the basin ahead. Evening Star responded to these waters with the same calm steadiness that had carried her across the great ocean. Her timbers creaked quietly as the wind filled the sails above, and the long ropes of the rigging shifted with small patient movements high against the sky. The trade winds had begun to settle into a steady breath. They arrived from the east with a warmth that had not been present in the northern latitudes of the crossing. The air felt softer here, touched by the quiet heat of distant islands that lay far beyond the horizon. The navigator rested one hand against the rail as he watched the sea. He had spent enough years upon the water to recognize these subtle changes. A sailor does not always see the boundary between oceans and seas, but he can feel them. The color of the water shifts, the wind carries a different scent, and the motion of the vessel grows gently unfamiliar. Somewhere ahead lay the scattered islands of the Caribbean Basin. They were still too distant to see, hidden beyond the wide curve of the earth. Yet the sea already carried their quiet influence. A seabird passed low over the water, gliding effortlessly across the swells before disappearing again toward the south. Birds like these often traveled far from land, yet their presence was always a quiet promise that the world beyond the horizon was changing. Above the deck, the sails of Evening Star breathed steadily with the wind. The canvas curved outward with each slow gust, then settled again with a soft sigh. The sound was familiar to every sailor aboard the vessel, a gentle rhythm that accompanied long voyages and patient navigation across distant waters. The navigator listened to these sounds as the ship moved forward. The creak of timber, the whisper of rope through wooden blocks, the quiet brushing of the sea against the hull. These were the small voices of a vessel at sea, and together they formed a kind of music that only sailors ever truly came to understand. On nights like this, he sometimes thought of home. The sea had a way of stirring such reflections, particularly when the wind moved gently and the horizon remained calm. His wife often preferred the quiet mornings for reading the letters he sent from distant voyages. He imagined her at the small table near the window, the morning light falling softly across the page as she unfolded the careful script of a letter that had crossed half the world. Those moments of imagined stillness often reminded him of the quiet Sundays they once spent walking together to Mass before the town had fully awakened. The bells would sound slowly across the rooftops, and the streets remained peaceful in the early light. It was a different rhythm from the sea, yet it carried the same sense of patient order that guided both marriage and navigation. The navigator allowed the memory to pass gently. Evening Star continued her steady progress across the warm waters of the Caribbean Basin, guided by the same winds that had carried countless ships through these seas long before this voyage began. Far ahead, beyond the horizon, the islands waited quietly beneath the sun. Morning arrived gradually across the Caribbean Basin. There was no sudden moment when night gave way to day. Instead, the horizon softened slowly, the darkness easing into a pale band of silver that stretched quietly across the eastern sky. The sea reflected this light with a calm patience, each gentle swell carrying a faint shimmer as Evening Star continued her steady progress through the warm waters. The trade winds had settled during the night. They moved with a reliability that sailors had trusted for centuries, arriving from the east with a steady breath that filled the sails without strain. The canvas above the deck curved outward with quiet confidence, holding the wind in a smooth and patient arc. The navigator had always admired the trade winds. Unlike the restless gales of the northern seas, these winds carried a sense of quiet purpose. They did not rush or falter. Instead, they moved with the calm consistency of something that had travelled this path for a very long time. High above the deck, the rigging stirred gently. Lines shifted against wooden blocks with soft rhythmic sounds, and the tall masts carried the sails with an almost effortless balance. The ship leaned only slightly to the wind, her bow dividing the warm sea with a smooth and deliberate motion. Evening Star seemed to understand these waters. Some ships fought the sea, straining against wind and swell as though the ocean were an opponent to be overcome. But vessels built for long voyages learned instead to move with the water, adjusting quietly to its rhythms. This ship had crossed many miles of open ocean already, and now she carried that same patient confidence into the quieter waters of the Caribbean Basin. The navigator rested beside the rail and watched the morning unfold. Small ripples of sunlight began to spread across the surface of the sea as the sun rose slowly. Behind them, each wave caught the light for a moment before releasing it again, creating a wide field of shifting reflections that moved gently across the horizon. A pair of seabirds appeared in the distance. They skimmed low above the water, their wings barely moving as they followed the invisible currents of air that travelled just above the swells. The birds circled once near the ship before gliding away again toward the southern horizon. Their presence suggested that land was not impossibly far away. Birds often travelled many miles from shore, yet experienced sailors always took quiet notice when they appeared. The sea itself seemed to carry small signals like these, subtle hints of the islands scattered throughout the basin. The navigator observed the wind carefully. The direction held steady, just as the charts and experience suggested it would. These trade winds had guided ships through the Caribbean for generations, carrying explorers, merchants, and fishermen across the same waters that Evening Star now crossed. The captain had remarked on their steadiness the evening before. They had spoken quietly at the stern, while the crew attended to the evening watch. The captain trusted the navigator's sense for currents and wind, and their brief conversations often carried the quiet tone of men who had sailed together long enough to understand one another without many words. Neither man felt the need to raise his voice or speak at length. A few observations about the wind, a brief consideration of the currents ahead, and the course for the coming hours was settled. The crew would simply see the ship continuing on her steady heading. Morning light continued to spread across the sea. The warmth of the rising sun touched the deckboards and the tall canvas above, and the wind carried a softness that hinted again at the presence of distant islands, somewhere beyond the far edge of the horizon. Evening Star moved onward through the quiet breath of the trade winds, her sails full and her course steady beneath the slowly brightening sky. By mid-morning, the Caribbean Sea had taken on its full colour. The pale silver tones of early dawn had deepened into a broad expanse of blue that stretched without interruption to every horizon. The water here was unlike the colder oceans the Navigator had known in northern voyages. It carried a softness in its colour, shifting gently between deep blue and quiet shades of turquoise whenever the sunlight touched the rolling swells. Evening Star moved steadily through these waters. Her bow parted the sea with the same patient rhythm that had carried her across the Atlantic weeks before. The wake behind the ship stretched outward in two long ribbons of rippling foam, slowly fading as the warm sea closed quietly behind her passage. The trade winds continued their steady work. They moved across the open basin with a calm persistence that sailors had relied upon for generations. Each sail remained filled with a quiet firmness, drawing the ship forward without strain. The canvas creaked softly against the rigging, and the long wooden spars swayed only slightly with the motion of the sea. It was a comfortable wind for sailing. The crew needed little effort to guide the vessel. A light adjustment of the helm here, a brief tightening of a line there, and the ship held her course with an almost effortless balance. The Navigator appreciated such mornings. They allowed a sailor to observe rather than struggle. When the sea was calm and the wind steady, a ship revealed its true character. One could feel the vessel working with the elements rather than resisting them. Evening Star had proven herself many times already. Her hull moved through the water with a quiet grace that spoke of careful design and long experience. Ships built for trade across the Atlantic needed both strength and patience, and this vessel carried both qualities with quiet confidence. From the quarterdeck, the navigator studied the horizon. There were no islands visible yet, only the broad circle of sea and sky, but the charts suggested they were drawing closer to the scattered chain of islands that rested across the Caribbean Basin. These islands rarely appeared suddenly. Often the first signs came slowly, a change in the colour of the water, the presence of distant birds, or the faint scent of land carried across the wind long before the shore itself could be seen. The navigator had learned to watch for these small signals. They were part of the quiet conversation between sailors and the sea. High above, thin clouds drifted slowly across the open sky. They moved gently with the same winds that carried the ship, their edges glowing softly in the warm light of the rising sun. Beneath them, the sea continued its slow-breathing motion, each swell rising and falling with a calm steadiness. The crew moved about their duties with an easy rhythm. Some men tended the rigging while others inspected the lines that secured the sails. A pair of sailors scrubbed sections of the deck with seawater, their quiet work accompanied by the gentle roll of the ship beneath their feet. The sounds aboard Evening Star were never loud. Instead, they formed a steady pattern of small movements. The soft knock of wood against wood, the low murmur of sailors speaking quietly to one another, the occasional creak of rope passing through a block high above the deck. All of it blended into the quiet life of the ship. The navigator often found comfort in these familiar sounds. They reminded him that a ship at sea was a small floating world, each man contributing his part to the long journey unfolding across the water. He paused for a moment near the stern rail. From this vantage point, the full sweep of the ship's wake could be seen stretching far behind them. The water churned white for a short distance before gradually smoothing again into the calm blue surface of the surrounding sea. It was here, watching that quiet path behind the ship, that the navigator sometimes allowed his thoughts to drift toward home. He imagined the narrow streets of his town in the early morning hours. There was a small church near the harbour where the bells would sound just after sunrise. The steady ringing carried across the rooftops and along the quiet streets while the town slowly woke to the new day. His wife often preferred those quiet mornings. She would walk with him to Mass before the day's work began, the air still cool and the harbour calm beneath the pale morning sky. The rhythm of those peaceful hours had always remained with him, even during long voyages far from shore. Out here on the Caribbean Sea, the memory returned in gentle moments. The steady wind, the calm water, and the slow movement of the ship often carried a quiet resemblance to those early mornings at home. But the sea also called him forward again. The voyage continued, and there were still many miles of warm blue water between the scattered islands of the Caribbean Basin. Evening Star sailed onward beneath the steady trade winds, her sails full and her course fixed toward the unseen shores ahead. Late morning settled slowly across the Caribbean Sea. The sun had climbed higher now. Its light fell warmly across the wide basin of water that surrounded the evening star. The sky above remained clear. Only a few thin clouds drifted slowly with the steady breath of the trade winds. The ship continued forward with calm certainty. Her sails held the wind easily. The canvas curved outward with a quiet strength. High above the deck, the rigging shifted gently, ropes moving softly against wood as the vessel rolled in the long Caribbean swells. The sea had grown calmer as the morning progressed. The Atlantic behind them had carried larger, slower waves. Here the water moved with smaller rhythms. The swells rose and fell in softer patterns, as if the basin itself breathed more slowly than the open ocean. The Navigator watched these changes carefully. A sailor learns to read the sea, as others might read a familiar road. Small signs reveal much to a patient observer. The colour of the water, the movement of birds, the shape of clouds on the horizon. Each of these quiet details tells a story. He noticed the water first. Near the ship it remained a deep and confident blue, but farther away toward the southern horizon, faint patches of lighter colour appeared beneath the surface. These pale streaks moved slowly through the water, carried by currents that travelled unseen beneath the ship. Floating among those currents were long strands of seagrass. They drifted past the hull in quiet clusters, golden brown against the blue sea. The Navigator recognized them immediately. Sailors had encountered such floating fields for generations across the warm waters of this region. The seagrass moved slowly with the currents. Small fish sometimes hid beneath the drifting leaves, and seabirds often followed the patches as they moved across the open basin. One such bird appeared now. It glided quietly above the water. Its wings stretched wide as it rode the invisible air currents above the waves. The bird circled once, near the ship, watching the vessel with calm curiosity, before continuing southward again. The Navigator followed its path with his eyes. Birds like these rarely wandered without purpose. Their presence suggested that land lay somewhere ahead, not close enough to see yet, but near enough for the rhythms of the islands to begin touching the surrounding sea. The captain joined him quietly near the rail. The two men spoke only briefly. Their voices remained low, so the conversation carried no farther than the wind between them. The captain had also noticed the drifting sea grass. It was a familiar sign to any sailor who had travelled these waters before. The currents of the Caribbean often gathered such floating fields, carrying them slowly between the islands. Together they studied the horizon. There was still no land in sight, only the endless meeting of sea and sky. Yet both men understood that the basin was beginning to change around them. Soon the water would grow lighter. Reefs and shallows would begin to influence the currents. Birds would appear more often, and the steady winds would carry faint scents of distant shores. The captain gave a small nod. Nothing more needed to be said. The course remained steady. Evening Star continued forward with the quiet patience of a vessel accustomed to long journeys. The Navigator remained at the rail after the captain returned to his duties. Moments like this often reminded him of how the sea revealed its secrets slowly. A sailor rarely discovers land suddenly. Instead, the world ahead announces itself piece by piece. Floating grass, passing birds, subtle changes in the water. All of them were quiet signals. Evening Star moved onward beneath the warm Caribbean sun. The steady trade winds filled her sails. The gentle swells lifted her hull. And somewhere beyond the wide horizon, the first islands of the basin waited quietly for the ship to arrive. The afternoon light spread slowly across the Caribbean Sea. The sun had moved higher now. Its warmth settled across the deck of Evening Star. The wood beneath the sailors' boots carried the heat of the day, yet the steady trade winds kept the air comfortable. The sea continued to change. Earlier in the morning the water had appeared deep and endless. Now the colour began to shift in subtle ways. Patches of lighter blue appeared far from the ship. The Navigator watched them carefully. They were not waves. They were the quiet language of the sea itself. Shallow banks and distant reefs often revealed themselves this way. The ocean floor rose slowly in places across the basin. Though the ship still sailed in deep water, the sunlight reached farther downward, where the sea became slightly shallower. This created new colours. Deep blue softened into calmer shades of turquoise. Here and there, pale streaks moved beneath the surface, like slow drifting clouds beneath the water. Evening Star sailed onward through these changing hues. Her bow cut gently through the warm sea. The wake behind her spread outward in two long white trails. Gradually those lines faded into the calm surface behind the ship. A sailor adjusted one of the forward lines. The rope slid quietly through the wooden block above his head. The sound was small, just a soft knock of wood and rope meeting together. The kind of sound that belongs to ships that travel many long miles. The Navigator listened to these familiar noises. They formed a steady pattern across the vessel, the wind breathing through the sails, the low creak of the mast, the quiet brushing of water against the hull. All of it spoke of calm progress. A cluster of drifting seagrass passed slowly along the starboard side. The Navigator leaned slightly over the rail to watch it pass. Small silver fish darted beneath the tangled leaves. They moved quickly, disappearing again into the deeper blue water below. Above them, the sky remained clear. A few seabirds had begun to appear more frequently now. They circled in wide arcs above the ship before gliding away again toward the southern horizon. Their presence confirmed what the Navigator already suspected. The islands were drawing nearer, not close enough to see yet, but near enough that the rhythms of the land were beginning to influence the sea. The captain walked the length of the quarter-deck. He paused briefly beside the Navigator. Together they studied the distant water where the lighter colours drifted slowly beneath the surface. Neither man needed many words. Years at sea had taught them to recognize these quiet signs. The captain gave a thoughtful nod before continuing his slow walk across the deck. Evening Star held her course. The wind remained steady, the sails remained full, and the sea carried the ship gently forward through the warm waters of the Caribbean Basin. The Navigator remained at the rail for several moments. Watching the shifting colours of the water often brought him a sense of calm reflection. The sea possessed a patience that few places on land could match. It moved slowly. It revealed its changes quietly, much like the long passages of life at home. He remembered once again the quiet mornings he had shared with his wife before voyages began, the walk through still streets, the distant ringing of church bells, the calm order of those early hours before the day unfolded. The sea held a different rhythm, yet the same sense of patience lived within both places. The Navigator allowed the memory to pass gently. Evening Star continued her steady progress across the basin. The water beneath her hull shifted slowly between deep blue and pale turquoise, and far ahead, still hidden beyond the horizon, the islands of the Caribbean waited quietly for the ship to arrive. The afternoon moved slowly across the Caribbean Basin. The sun hung high above the ship now, bright but softened by the steady breath of the trade winds. The air carried warmth, yet the moving wind kept the deck comfortable beneath the sailors' feet. Evening Star continued forward with calm patience. Her hull rose gently with each passing swell. The movement of the ship was steady now, slower, softer. The long Atlantic waves had faded behind them, replaced by the smaller breathing rhythms of the Caribbean Sea. The Navigator studied the water carefully. The surface told quiet stories to anyone willing to observe long enough. Currents moved beneath the visible waves, guiding floating grass and drifting leaves along invisible paths across the basin. Several patches of seagrass moved slowly past the ship. They gathered in loose fields upon the water. Their tangled strands glowed golden in the sunlight. Beneath them, small fish darted in quick flashes of silver. The Navigator leaned lightly against the rail. He watched how the seagrass drifted, not directly with the wind, but along a quieter direction that revealed the hidden currents below. These were the slow rivers of the ocean. They moved unseen beneath the surface, carrying warmth, carrying life, carrying ships gently across the wide spaces between islands. Evening Star rode these currents now. Her course remained steady, guided by wind above and water below. The sails held their full shape against the breeze. The ropes and rigging shifted with small patient sounds high along the masts. A sailor crossed the deck carrying a coil of rope. His boots struck the planks with a soft, hollow rhythm. The sound blended easily with the quiet language of the ship. There were many such sounds aboard a vessel at sea. The gentle creak of wood, the whisper of rope against canvas, the steady brushing of water along the hull. Together they formed the calm music of a ship in motion. A bird appeared again. It glided low across the surface of the sea before rising on a small current of wind. The navigator followed its path with quiet interest. Birds often travelled between islands. Their movements sometimes revealed more about nearby land than any chart could show. The captain stepped beside him once more. They exchanged only a few quiet words. The conversation remained brief. Experienced sailors seldom needed long discussions when the sea spoke clearly. Both men had seen the drifting seagrass. Both had noticed the birds. And both understood what these small signs suggested. Land was drawing nearer. Not yet within sight, but near enough that the quiet influence of the islands had begun to shape the surrounding waters. The captain nodded once before returning to the quarterdeck. Evening Star continued her steady journey. The ship moved forward beneath the warm Caribbean sun. Her sails remained full. Her course remained true. The navigator stayed near the rail for several moments longer. Watching the slow movement of the sea often invited quiet reflection. The ocean carried a patience that mirrored other parts of life. He thought again of home, of the quiet mornings when the harbour still slept and the church bells called the town gently toward mass. Those peaceful walks beside his wife had always carried a calm steadiness of their own. The sea held that same patience, different in form, yet similar in spirit. The navigator let the memory drift away like the floating grass upon the water. Evening Star sailed onward through the gentle currents of the Caribbean Basin, and somewhere ahead, beyond the wide circle of the horizon, the first islands waited quietly beneath the sun. The afternoon continued its quiet passage across the Caribbean Sea. The sun had begun its slow movement toward the western sky. Its light still warmed the deck of Evening Star, but the angle of the sunlight had softened slightly, casting longer reflections across the rolling water. The wind remained steady. The trade winds rarely hurried. They moved with calm persistence across the basin, guiding ships along paths that sailors had followed for centuries. Evening Star moved easily within this steady breath. Her sails held the wind with quiet confidence. The canvas curved outward, smooth and full, drawing the ship forward through the deep blue water. The navigator watched the horizon as the hours passed. The sea carried many small signs for those who looked carefully enough. Some appeared in the water itself. Others appeared in the sky above. It was the birds that he noticed first. A single bird glided past the ship, wings stretched wide as it rode the moving air above the waves. A second followed soon after, circling once before drifting away toward the south. Soon there were several. They moved quietly through the sky, rising and falling with the invisible paths of the wind. Some skimmed low across the water, while others circled high above the ship before continuing their slow travel across the basin. Birds rarely travelled without reason. Many of them nested upon the islands scattered across these waters. Their daily journeys often carried them far from land, yet their presence always suggested that shore lay somewhere within reach of their wings. The Navigator followed their movement carefully. Each bird passed across the sky with calm purpose. None appeared hurried. None appeared lost. They moved as though the sea itself guided their flight. Evening Star sailed onward beneath them. The ship held her steady course. The helm required little correction. The wind remained reliable, and the sea carried the vessel forward with patient rhythm. A sailor near the foremast adjusted a line. The rope moved slowly through the block above him. The sound was soft, just the quiet knock of wood and rope meeting together. Small sounds like these filled the ship. The low murmur of voices, the creak of timber shifting gently with the sea, the steady brushing of water along the hull. Together they formed the quiet life of the vessel. The Navigator leaned lightly against the rail. Watching birds above the open sea often reminded him how wide the world truly was. These small travellers moved easily between distant islands that sailors sometimes spent days searching for. The sea connected everything: ships, birds, currents, winds. All of them moved within the same great rhythm. The captain appeared briefly beside him again. They watched the passing birds together in silence. The captain followed the path of one that circled slowly before drifting westward. He gave a small thoughtful nod. More birds meant the islands were nearer now, still beyond sight, but closer with every mile the ship travelled. The captain returned to his duties without another word. Evening Star continued her quiet journey beneath the steady trade winds. The birds gradually disappeared again into the bright afternoon sky. The sea stretched wide and calm around the ship, its deep blue surface rising and falling in gentle motion. The Navigator remained at the rail for several moments longer. Somewhere beyond the far horizon, the islands waited patiently beneath the sun, and the birds of the Caribbean wind continued their quiet journeys between sea and shore. The afternoon drifted quietly toward evening. The sun had begun its slow descent across the Caribbean sky. Its light softened as it travelled westward, turning the surface of the sea into a wide field of gentle reflections. Evening Star continued her patient voyage. The ship moved steadily through the warm basin waters. Her bow lifted slowly over each passing swell before settling again into the calm rhythm of the sea. The trade winds remained faithful. They carried the vessel forward without urgency. The sails above the deck remained full and smooth. the canvas breathing slowly with the steady motion of the air. The navigator appreciated this hour of the day. Late afternoon often brought a special calm to the sea. The brightness of midday softened, shadows lengthened across the deck, and the colours of the water began to change once more. The deep blues of earlier hours slowly faded into warmer tones. Sunlight stretched across the surface of the sea in long golden paths. Each swell caught the light for a moment before releasing it again as the water rolled quietly onward. The ship's wake glimmered behind them. 2 white ribbons spread slowly outward from the stern. They shimmered briefly in the lowering sunlight before dissolving back into the darker water. The crew moved about their tasks with familiar ease. One sailor checked the tension of the forward lines. Another inspected a section of rigging along the main mast. Their work required little effort in such steady wind. The sounds aboard the vessel remained gentle. A rope slid softly through a wooden block. A loose spar creaked quietly as the ship rolled with the sea. The water brushed the hull with a slow whispering motion. These were the ordinary sounds of life at sea. The navigator leaned against the rail once more. Watching the changing light often encouraged quiet reflection. The sea had a way of slowing a man's thoughts, allowing the mind to move with the same patient rhythm as the waves. He studied the horizon again. Still no islands appeared, yet the basin itself felt different now. The water seemed warmer. The wind carried a faint softness that suggested distant land somewhere ahead. The birds had grown more frequent. Several passed quietly above the ship during the afternoon. They travelled with calm purpose, gliding easily between currents of wind invisible to the sailors below. The navigator followed their movements with quiet interest. Birds often knew the islands long before sailors saw them. Far behind the ship, the sunlit path of their journey continued to fade slowly into the distance. It stretched across the water, like a memory of the miles already travelled. The captain appeared briefly on the quarter-deck. He paused to look across the western sky, where the sunlight had begun to deepen into warmer shades of gold. The 2 men exchanged a brief nod. There was comfort in such quiet understanding. The course remained steady. The wind remained reliable. And Evening Star continued her calm progress through the basin. The navigator watched the light slowly changing across the water. Soon the evening colours would begin to appear. The sky would soften further, and the sea would grow quieter as the day slowly prepared to give way to night. For now the vessel sailed onward, beneath the gentle light of late afternoon. The warm Caribbean wind filled her sails, the calm sea lifted her hull, and the long journey between the islands continued with patient grace. The afternoon slowly gave way to evening. The sun had begun its quiet descent toward the western horizon. Its light softened across the Caribbean Basin, spreading warm golden reflections across the rolling surface of the water. Evening Star continued her steady course. The ship moved with calm assurance through the gentle swells. Each rise of the hull was followed by a slow and easy descent as the sea carried the vessel onward. The wind remained faithful. The trade winds had guided ships across these waters for centuries. They arrived each day with quiet consistency, filling the sails without strain. The canvas above the deck breathed slowly with the air. The rigging shifted with small sounds high along the masts. Rope brushed softly against wood as the ship rolled beneath the wind. The navigator watched the changing light. Evening often brought a different character to the sea. The bright blues of the afternoon slowly faded into deeper tones as the sun lowered toward the horizon. Long streaks of gold appeared across the water. Each passing swell carried a narrow line of light that stretched outward before dissolving again into the darker blue of the surrounding sea. The wake behind the ship shimmered quietly. For a moment it glowed with reflected sunlight, before fading once more into the calm surface of the basin. A small group of seabirds crossed the sky. They travelled slowly above the ship, wings steady as they rode the evening currents of air. One bird dipped low toward the water before rising again toward the fading light. The navigator followed their path for a moment. Birds often returned toward land as evening approached. Their quiet journeys sometimes hinted at islands hidden beyond the wide horizon. The crew moved calmly about the deck. One sailor checked the forward sail, another secured a loose coil of rope beside the main mast. Their movements were unhurried. A ship at sea rarely rushed its work. The sea itself encouraged patience. The navigator rested both hands upon the rail. Watching the day slowly close often reminded him of evenings at home. The quiet hours before nightfall carried a calm that was not unlike the peace found upon the open sea. He thought briefly of the small harbour town he had left behind. In the evenings, the bells of the church would sometimes sound. Across the water, the harbour would grow still as the sun lowered behind the distant hills. Those quiet hours had always brought a sense of order and reflection. The sea offered something similar, different in form, yet familiar in spirit. Evening star sailed onward beneath the lowering sun. The wind held steady within the sails. The water moved with gentle rhythm beneath the hull. And somewhere ahead, beyond the glowing horizon, the islands of the Caribbean Basin waited quietly for night to arrive. The sun moved steadily toward the western horizon. Its light softened as the afternoon slowly gave way to evening. Long paths of gold stretched across the surface of the Caribbean Sea, shifting gently with each slow swell. Evening star continued forward with calm certainty. Her hull lifted and settled in the quiet rhythm of the water. The motion of the vessel was steady now. The open Atlantic behind them felt like a distant memory. The basin waters carried a different temperament. The swells were smaller here. The sea breathed in slower patterns. The currents moved quietly beneath the surface, guiding the ship through warm water that had travelled long distances between the islands. The navigator watched the water closely. Small variations in colour moved beneath the sunlight. Some patches appeared darker, others shone pale turquoise, where the seafloor rose slowly toward unseen reefs far away. These were quiet signs. The sea rarely revealed its secrets suddenly. Instead, it spoke slowly, offering patient clues to those who spent enough years observing its surface. A small cluster of seagrass drifted past the bow. The tangled leaves glowed golden in the fading light. Tiny fish darted among the strands before vanishing again into deeper water. Evening star passed the drifting patch without disturbance. The ship's wake spread outward behind the stern, two long lines of rippling white that slowly faded back into the calm blue sea. The crew moved quietly across the deck. One sailor adjusted a coil of rope near the main mast. Another inspected the forward sail where the canvas held the steady breath of the trade winds. Their work required little effort. Ships that travelled with the wind seldom demanded urgency from their crews. The navigator rested against the rail. The lowering sun reflected softly across the water. The horizon glowed with warm colour as the day slowly prepared to close. Moments like this often invited reflection. The quiet of the sea reminded him of evenings at home, when the harbour grew still and the last light of day settled across the water. Sometimes the bells of the small church would sound gently across the town. He remembered walking beside his wife through the calm streets toward the harbour, the air cooling as the sun slipped below the hills beyond the water. Those evenings had carried their own quiet rhythm. The sea held a similar patience, different, yet familiar. The navigator allowed the memory to pass gently. Evening star continued onward beneath the glowing sky. The sails held the wind, the ship held her course, and the warm Caribbean waters carried the vessel slowly toward the unseen islands ahead. Above the horizon, the sky began to deepen in colour. Soon the first evening stars would appear, and the quiet watch of the night would begin once again upon the sea. The sun had begun its slow descent toward the horizon. Its bright afternoon light softened into warmer tones that spread across the Caribbean Basin. The water reflected these colours in long shifting bands of gold and amber. Evening star sailed steadily onward. The ship moved with patient rhythm across the quiet sea. Her hull rose gently over each passing swell before settling again into the calm motion of the water. The wind held steady in the sails. The trade winds rarely hurried. They moved with quiet reliability across the basin, filling the canvas above the deck with a steady breath of air. The sails curved smoothly against the sky. Ropes shifted softly along the rigging. The tall masts creaked with small movements as the ship adjusted to the slow breathing of the sea. The navigator watched the western horizon. Sunset at sea was rarely sudden. The day withdrew slowly. Light softened little by little until the ocean seemed to glow with its own quiet warmth. Long reflections stretched across the water. Each passing swell carried a narrow ribbon of sunlight that shimmered briefly before dissolving into darker blue. Behind the ship, the wake glowed softly. For a moment the churning water held the golden colour of the sky before fading once more into the calm basin. A few seabirds passed quietly overhead. Their wings moved slowly as they followed the evening currents of wind. One bird dipped toward the water before gliding away again toward the distant horizon. The Navigator followed their path for a moment. Birds often returned toward their islands as evening approached. Their quiet journeys hinted again that land lay somewhere beyond the wide circle of sea and sky. The crew worked quietly as the day drew toward its close. A sailor secured a loose line near the main mast. Another checked the forward sail where the wind filled the canvas with gentle strength. Their movements were calm and unhurried. Life aboard a ship at sea followed the rhythm of wind and water. The Navigator rested his hands upon the rail. Watching the slow fall of evening often invited reflection. The sea carried a stillness at this hour that reminded him of peaceful evenings at home. He remembered the small harbour town, where he and his wife had once watched the sun set across quiet water. Sometimes the bells of the church would sound softly as the evening light faded. The streets would grow still while the town settled into the calm hours of night. The memory returned gently. The sea possessed its own version of that quiet. Evening Star continued her steady course. The wind held the sails, the water lifted the hull, and the sky slowly deepened as the sun sank closer to the horizon. Soon the first stars would appear above the Caribbean Sea, and the long quiet watch of the night would begin once more for the sailors of Evening Star. The sun moved slowly toward the horizon. Its light softened across the wide Caribbean Basin. The brightness of the afternoon had faded now, replaced by long, gentle reflections that stretched across the water. Evening Star continued her steady voyage. The ship rose slowly upon the swells, then settled again into the calm breathing rhythm of the sea. The trade winds remained constant. They moved across the open water with quiet patience. The sails above the deck held their shape against the warm air. Canvas shifted softly. Rope brushed against wood high along the masts. Small creaks moved through the rigging as the vessel adjusted to the motion of the water. The Navigator watched the horizon. Sunset at sea often arrived slowly. The sky rarely changed all at once. Instead, the colours deepened gradually. Gold softened into amber. Amber drifted slowly toward orange. And the wide Caribbean sky carried these colours across the evening water. The sea reflected every change. Each passing swell lifted a small ribbon of sunlight. Then the light slipped away again as the wave moved onward through the basin. Behind the ship, the wake shimmered quietly. For a few moments it held the golden color of the sky before dissolving again into deeper blue. The crew moved calmly across the deck. A sailor walked slowly along the starboard rail. Another adjusted a coil of rope near the forward mast. Their work followed the natural rhythm of the ship. There was no need for hurry. The sea itself discouraged haste. The navigator rested quietly against the rail. Moments like this often encouraged reflection. The calm fall of evening carried a stillness that felt familiar to him. He remembered the quiet harbor of his home. In the evenings, the water there would grow still as the sun slipped behind the distant hills. Fishing boats returned slowly to their moorings. Sometimes the bells of the church would sound across the town. He and his wife would hear them from the small street where they lived. The sound drifted gently through the evening air as the day came quietly to its close. Those memories often returned to him during calm voyages. The sea possessed a similar patience. The same sense that time could move slowly, that the world could settle into quiet order as the light faded. The navigator allowed the memory to drift away like the ship's wake across the water. Evening star continued forward beneath the glowing sky. The sails held the wind. The sea carried the vessel gently onward. And far beyond the glowing horizon, the scattered islands of the Caribbean Basin waited quietly for night to arrive. Evening settled slowly across the Caribbean Basin. The sun had slipped below the western horizon now. Its final glow lingered along the edge of the sea. For a time the sky held a soft band of color, fading gold, quiet amber. Then deeper shades of blue slowly followed. Evening star continued forward. The ship moved with the same calm patience she had carried throughout the day. Her hull rose gently upon the slow swells, then settled again into the warm water. The trade winds remained steady. They no longer felt bright and energetic as they had earlier in the afternoon. Instead, they moved with a softer breath. The sails above the deck held that wind easily. Canvas curved outward in smooth, quiet lines. Ropes shifted softly along the rigging. Wood creaked faintly as the tall masts adjusted to the motion of the sea. The navigator watched the sky carefully. This was the hour when the first stars began to appear. At first they were faint, small points of light that emerged slowly from the deepening blue of the sky. A single star appeared low in the east, then another. Soon several more revealed themselves across the quiet heavens. Sailors had trusted these stars for centuries, long before charts were carefully drawn. long before instruments guided navigation. The stars had offered their steady guidance to every vessel that crossed the open sea. Evening Star sailed beneath them now. The ship moved quietly through the darkening basin, while the first lights of night gathered overhead. The crew continued their evening routines. A lantern was lit near the quarterdeck. Its warm glow spread across a small circle of deckboards. Another lantern appeared near the main mast. Their soft light moved gently with the ship as it rose and settled upon the swells. The navigator rested both hands upon the rail. Night at sea carried a calm unlike any other place in the world. The noise of the day faded, the colors of the sky softened, and the wide ocean seemed to breathe more slowly beneath the stars. He listened to the quiet sounds of the ship, the slow whisper of water along the hull, the faint movement of rope through the rigging, the soft creak of timber adjusting to the sea. All of it blended into the calm music of the voyage. The navigator sometimes thought of home during these hours, the quiet moments after evening mass, when the town had grown still and the harbour water reflected the first lights of night. He and his wife would walk slowly along the edge of the harbour, the bells of the church fading into the distance as darkness settled gently across the town. Those memories returned softly now. The sea carried a similar peace, different in place, yet familiar in spirit. Evening Star continued her calm passage beneath the rising stars. The wind held steady in her sails. The sea moved quietly beneath her hull. And somewhere ahead, beyond the wide dark horizon, the islands of the Caribbean Basin waited beneath the same gathering night. Night settled gently across the Caribbean Sea. The final glow of sunset had faded from the horizon. In its place, the wide sky deepened into calm shades of midnight blue. Above the quiet basin, the stars appeared one by one. At first, only a few points of light were visible, small and distant. Then, slowly more emerged across the sky until the heavens were scattered with quiet brilliance. Evening Star sailed beneath this gathering night. The ship moved steadily through the warm waters. Her hull rose and fell in the slow rhythm of the sea. The trade winds had softened slightly after sunset. They still filled the sails, but the wind now carried a gentler breath than it had during the bright hours of the day. The canvas above the deck shifted quietly. Ropes moved through the rigging with soft, patient sounds. The tall masts creaked faintly as the ship adjusted to the slow motion of the swells. Lanterns glowed softly along the deck. Their warm light formed small circles against the dark wood of the planks. Each lantern swayed gently with the movement of the vessel. The crew prepared for the night watch. Two sailors moved quietly near the bow, checking the lines that secured the forward sails. Another walked slowly along the deck, carrying a lantern whose light drifted across the rigging. The work was calm and familiar. Ships that sailed long distances relied on steady routines. Each man aboard knew his duty when the night watch began. The navigator stood near the stern rail. From there he could see the long dark path of the sea stretching behind the vessel. The wake shimmered faintly under the starlight before fading into the darkness of the basin. Night at sea possessed a special quiet. The noise of the day disappeared. The brightness of sunlight was replaced by the soft glow of stars and lanterns. Even the wind seemed to move more gently through the sails. The navigator listened to the small sounds of the ship. The whisper of water brushing the hull. The low creak of timber adjusting to the sea. The faint movement of rope high along the mast. These sounds formed the calm language of a vessel travelling through the night. Moments like this often invited quiet thought. The navigator sometimes remembered the peaceful evenings he had shared with his wife at home. After the final bells of the church faded across the harbour, the town would grow still. The water beside the docks reflected the first stars of night. He and his wife would walk slowly along the harbour road, the air cool, the town quiet, the sound of gentle water against the boats tied to their moorings. The memory returned softly. The sea carried a similar peace, different in place, yet familiar in spirit. Evening Star continued her patient journey through the dark Caribbean Basin. The wind remained steady in her sails. The stars glowed above the silent sea, and far beyond the wide horizon, the islands waited quietly beneath the same calm night. Night had fully settled across the Caribbean Basin. The sky above the ship was now deep and clear. Countless stars shimmered softly across the dark horizon, reflecting faintly upon the quiet surface of the sea. Evening Star moved steadily through the warm water. Her hull lifted slowly with each passing swell, then settled again with gentle patience. The wind remained steady within the sails. The trade winds no longer carried the warmth of the afternoon sun. Instead, they moved across the deck with a cooler breath that drifted quietly through the rigging. The sails shifted softly. Canvas curved against the dark sky, while ropes moved slowly along the tall masts. The sounds were small and familiar. Wood creaked faintly. Rope brushed against timber. Water whispered along the hull. Together they formed the quiet music of the voyage. Lanterns glowed gently across the deck. Their warm light moved slowly with the motion of the ship. Each lantern swayed in small arcs as Evening Star rolled through the calm sea. The crew of the night watch moved quietly. One sailor walked the length of the deck near the bow. Another checked the lines that held the sails steady in the wind. Their voices were low. Night at sea encouraged calm work and quiet speech. The navigator stood near the stern. From there he could see the wide darkness of the basin stretching behind the ship. The wake shimmered faintly beneath the stars, before fading again into the deep water. Moments like this carried a rare stillness. The sea seemed to breathe slowly beneath the vessel. The sky remained vast and silent above. The navigator listened to the gentle sounds around him. The steady wind in the sails, the soft creak of the rigging, the quiet movement of water along the hull. These sounds had accompanied sailors for centuries. They were the same sounds heard by countless ships that had crossed these waters long before Evening Star began her journey. The navigator rested his hands lightly on the rail. Watching the night sea often brought peaceful memories. He thought of evenings at home when the harbour water reflected the stars, when the quiet streets of the town grew still after the final bells of the church. Sometimes he and his wife would walk beside the water before returning home. The harbour would lie calm beneath the night sky. Small lanterns glowed along the docks, and the sea beyond the harbour mouth stretched dark and wide beneath the same distant stars. The memory lingered quietly. The sea before him now held a similar calm. Evening Star continued her patient voyage. The wind filled her sails, the stars guided her course, and the warm waters of the Caribbean Basin carried the vessel steadily through the peaceful hours of the night. The night had grown deeper across the Caribbean Basin. The last traces of evening had long since faded. The sky now stretched wide and dark above the sea, scattered with quiet constellations that glimmered softly over the water. Evening Star sailed steadily onward. Her hull rose gently upon the slow swells, then settled again into the calm breathing rhythm of the sea. The trade winds continued their quiet work. They moved through the sails with patient consistency. The canvas above the deck curved smoothly against the dark sky. Ropes shifted slowly along the masts. Timber creaked faintly as the ship adjusted to the movement of the water. The sounds were soft, familiar, comforting. The navigator listened carefully. Night at sea carried a stillness that few places in the world could match. The noise of the day had disappeared entirely. Only the small voices of the ship remained. The whisper of water against the hull, the slow creak of the rigging, the quiet breathing of wind within the sails. Lanterns glowed dimly along the deck. Their light formed small pools upon the wooden planks. Each lantern swayed gently with the motion of the vessel. A sailor crossed the deck, carrying one of those lanterns. The warm glow drifted across the rigging before disappearing again into the darker shadows near the bow. The night watch continued its quiet duties. Men walked the deck slowly, checking the lines and sails that carried the ship forward through the basin. Their voices remained low. Ships traveling through darkness encouraged quiet work. The navigator stood near the stern rail. From that place he could watch the long dark wake trailing behind the ship. The water shimmered faintly under the starlight before fading again into the vast night. Above him, the stars moved slowly across the sky. Sailors had followed those distant lights for centuries, long before instruments guided ships across the sea. The stars had always offered their quiet direction. The navigator studied them with practiced patience. They remained steady companions through the long hours of night. Moments like this often encouraged reflection. The calm darkness of the sea reminded him of the quiet harbor of his home. Late at night, the town would grow silent. The harbor water would lie still beneath the stars. Small lanterns along the docks reflected softly upon the surface of the water. Sometimes he and his wife would pause beside the harbor wall and watch the quiet sea together. The memory returned gently. The ocean carried a similar peace, different in distance, yet familiar in spirit. Evening Star continued her patient voyage through the midnight waters of the Caribbean Basin. The wind remained steady in her sails. The stars remained bright above the dark sea, and the long journey toward the unseen islands continued beneath the calm watch of the night. The night sea stretched wide and calm around the ship. Above the dark waters, the sky remained clear. The stars shone quietly across the Caribbean Basin, their light reflecting faintly upon the slow-rolling swells. Evening Star continued her steady passage. The vessel moved with patient rhythm through the water. Each swell lifted the hull gently before allowing it to settle once more into the warm sea. The trade winds remained steady. They moved softly through the sails, guiding the ship forward with calm persistence. The canvas above the deck curved against the night sky. Ropes shifted quietly along the rigging. The tall masts creaked faintly as the ship adjusted to the movement of the basin waters. These sounds were small, soft, familiar. The navigator listened to them carefully. Night at sea revealed the quiet language of a vessel more clearly than the daylight hours ever could. The whisper of water along the hull, the slow breathing of wind within the sails, the faint knock of wood against rope high along the mast. Together these sounds formed the calm music of the voyage. Lanterns glowed gently along the deck. Their warm light swayed in slow arcs as the ship rolled with the swells. The glow touched the wooden planks and the lines of rope before fading again into darkness. A sailor crossed the deck carrying one of those lanterns. The light moved slowly with him, drifting across the rigging and sails before disappearing near the bow. The crew of the night watch continued their quiet routines. One man inspected the forward sail, another checked the tension of a line near the mast. Their work was calm. Ships that travelled through darkness required patience and steady hands. The navigator remained near the stern rail. From that place he could see the long dark path of the ship's wake stretching behind the vessel. The water shimmered faintly beneath the stars before fading again into the wide night. Above him, the sky remained vast. Constellations moved slowly across the heavens, following paths that sailors had trusted for countless generations. Those distant lights had guided many voyages before this one. They continued their quiet watch over the sea. Moments like this often carried deep stillness. The sea moved slowly, the wind moved gently. The ship travelled steadily through the dark waters of the basin. The navigator rested his hands upon the rail. Watching the quiet sea often brought memories of peaceful nights at home. The harbour would lie calm beneath the stars. Lanterns along the docks would reflect softly upon the water. Sometimes he and his wife would pause beside the harbour wall and watch the still sea together. The memory returned gently. The ocean held a similar calm, different in distance, yet familiar in spirit. Evening Star continued her patient journey beneath the quiet sky. The wind remained steady. The stars remained bright. And the long voyage across the Caribbean Basin carried on through the peaceful hours of the night. The night sea remained calm and wide around the ship. Above the dark basin, the sky stretched endlessly. The stars shimmered quietly across the heavens, their distant light reflecting faintly upon the slow-moving water. Evening Star sailed onward. The vessel rose gently upon the swells before settling again into the warm Caribbean Sea. Her movement was steady, calm, patient. The wind remained faithful in the sails. The trade winds moved softly through the canvas, guiding the ship across the basin with quiet consistency. The sails curved smoothly against the dark sky. Ropes shifted along the rigging. Timber creaked softly as the tall masts adjusted to the slow-breathing motion of the sea. These were the familiar sounds of a vessel at night. The navigator listened carefully. Without the noise of daylight work, the quiet language of the ship became clearer. Every small movement carried its own gentle sound. Water brushed the hull with a slow whisper. Rope moved softly against wood. The sails breathed with the steady wind. Lanterns glowed along the deck. Their warm light created small islands of brightness against the dark planks. Each lantern swayed slowly as the ship rolled through the water. The movement of that light was gentle. Soft circles of gold drifted across rope and timber before fading again into shadow. A sailor walked slowly across the deck, carrying one of those lanterns. The glow travelled with him. It illuminated the rigging above for a moment, before drifting away again toward the bow of the ship. The night watch continued its calm duties. One sailor inspected the lines along the foremast. Another walked quietly along the rail, listening to the wind and watching the dark horizon. Their work was patient. Ships crossing long distances required steady attention through the night hours. The navigator stood near the stern. From there he could see the ship's wake trailing far behind them. The water shimmered faintly beneath the stars before fading again into darkness. Above him the sky remained vast and silent. The constellations moved slowly across the heavens. Sailors had watched these same patterns for centuries while crossing the oceans of the world. The navigator followed their quiet paths. They offered a sense of calm direction across the sea. Moments like this often brought peaceful reflection. The stillness of the night reminded him of quiet evenings beside the harbour of his home. Lanterns along the docks would glow softly upon the water. Their reflections moved gently across the calm surface of the harbour. Sometimes he and his wife would walk slowly along the edge of that water. The night air cool, the town quiet. The memory returned softly. The sea carried a similar peace. Evening Star continued her steady passage through the warm waters of the Caribbean Basin. The lanterns swayed gently. The sails held the wind, and the stars above watched quietly as the ship sailed onward through the deep calm of the night. The night sea stretched wide and peaceful around the ship. Above the dark waters, the sky shimmered with countless stars. Their distant light scattered softly across the surface of the Caribbean Basin. Evening Star sailed quietly beneath that sky. The vessel moved with slow and steady rhythm. Each passing swell lifted the hull before allowing it to settle again into the calm sea. The trade winds remained steady. They moved gently through the sails, guiding the ship across the warm waters of the basin. Canvas curved against the night sky. Ropes shifted softly along the rigging. The tall masts creaked faintly as the ship adjusted to the motion of the swells. The navigator listened to these small sounds. Night revealed them more clearly than the daylight ever could. The whisper of water along the hull, the quiet movement of rope through the rigging, the soft breathing of wind within the sails. Together they formed the steady language of the voyage. The sea itself carried a gentle glow. The stars above reflected faintly upon the surface of the water. Each swell caught those distant lights for a moment before releasing them again into the darkness. The effect was subtle. Small glimmers of light drifted across the moving sea. The navigator watched those reflections carefully. It was a quiet reminder of how closely the sky and sea were joined during the long hours of night. Lanterns continued to glow along the deck. Their warm light swayed slowly with the ship. Each lantern traced a gentle arc across the wooden planks before drifting again into shadow. A sailor crossed the deck carrying one of those lanterns. The glow moved across the rigging and sails before fading near the bow of the ship. The night watch continued its steady duties. Men inspected the lines. They listened to the wind. They watched the dark horizon where sea and sky met in quiet stillness. The navigator remained near the stern rail. From there he could see the long trail of water behind the vessel. The wake shimmered faintly beneath the stars before fading once more into the darkness of the basin. Moments like this carried deep calm. The sea moved slowly. The wind moved gently. The ship traveled patiently through the warm waters of the Caribbean. The navigator allowed his thoughts to drift. He remembered evenings beside the harbour at home. The quiet water reflecting lantern light along the docks. Sometimes he and his wife would pause beside the harbour wall, the town behind them growing still, the sea before them stretching dark beneath the same distant stars. The memory returned softly. The ocean carried a similar peace. Evening Star continued her steady journey through the night sea. The sails held the wind. The water carried the hull, and the stars above watched quietly as the long voyage across the Caribbean Basin continued. The night sea moved quietly beneath the ship. Far from land, the waters of the Caribbean Basin rolled in slow, patient swells. Each wave lifted gently before easing back into the dark surface of the sea. Evening Star continued her calm passage. The vessel moved forward with steady grace. Her hull rose slowly upon the swells and settled again into the warm water. The wind remained faithful. The trade winds moved softly through the sails. Canvas curved smoothly against the night sky as the ship followed her quiet course. Ropes shifted along the rigging. Wood creaked faintly within the tall masts. These small sounds travelled through the night air with gentle clarity. The navigator listened carefully. Without the busy work of daylight, the language of the ship became easier to hear. The whisper of water along the hull, the slow breathing of wind in the sails, the soft movement of rope across timber. These sounds formed the quiet rhythm of the voyage. The sea itself moved with steady patience. Beneath the surface, long currents travelled across the basin. These slow rivers of water guided ships in subtle ways. The navigator watched the water beside the hull. Occasionally faint lines of foam appeared where two currents met. The patterns moved slowly across the surface before dissolving again into the wider sea. Lanterns swayed gently across the deck. Their warm glow created small circles of light against the wooden planks. Each lantern rocked slowly as the ship rose and settled upon the swells. A sailor crossed the deck, carrying one of those lanterns. The light drifted with him across the rigging before disappearing again near the bow. The night watch continued its calm duties. Men walked the deck quietly. They listened to the wind. They studied the dark horizon where sea and sky met in peaceful silence. The navigator remained near the stern rail. From that place he could see the long trail of the ship's wake stretching behind them. The water shimmered faintly beneath the starlight before fading again into darkness. Above him, the sky remained wide and silent. Constellations moved slowly across the heavens. Those distant lights had guided sailors for countless generations. The navigator followed their quiet paths across the sky. Moments like this often carried deep stillness. The sea moved slowly. The wind moved gently. The ship traveled patiently through the warm basin waters. The navigator allowed his thoughts to drift. He remembered evenings beside the harbor of his home, the quiet water reflecting lantern light along the docks. Sometimes he and his wife would pause beside the harbor wall and watch the calm sea together. The town behind them, quiet. The harbor before them, peaceful beneath the stars. The memory returned gently. The ocean carried a similar calm. Evening Star continued her steady voyage through the night. The wind held the sails, the currents carried the ship, and the wide Caribbean Basin remained peaceful beneath the quiet watch of the stars. The long hours of midnight had settled across the Caribbean Basin. The sky above the ship was deep and clear. Countless stars shimmered quietly over the dark waters of the sea. Evening Star moved steadily beneath that silent sky. The vessel rose gently upon each passing swell before settling again into the warm basin water. Her motion was calm and predictable. The trade winds continued their quiet work. They flowed steadily through the sails. The canvas above the deck curved smoothly against the night air. Ropes shifted softly along the rigging. Wood creaked faintly within the tall masts as the ship adjusted to the slow-breathing rhythm of the sea. The navigator listened to those familiar sounds. Without the noise of daylight labor, the ship revealed its quiet language more clearly. Water whispered along the hull. The sails breathed with the wind. Rope brushed gently against timber. Together these sounds formed the steady rhythm of the voyage. Lanterns continued to glow along the deck. Their warm light created small islands of brightness across the dark planks. Each lantern swayed slowly with the movement of the vessel. A sailor passed quietly along the rail, carrying one of those lanterns. The glow moved with him across rope and sail before drifting again into shadow near the bow. The night watch moved calmly through their duties. Men walked the deck slowly. They listened to the wind. They watched the dark horizon where sea and sky blended together beneath the stars. The navigator remained near the stern rail. From that place he could see the long dark path of the ship's wake trailing behind the vessel. The water shimmered faintly beneath the starlight before fading again into the wide basin. Above him, the sky remained vast. The constellations drifted slowly across the heavens. Sailors had trusted these distant lights for centuries while crossing the oceans of the world. The navigator followed their quiet movement. They offered calm guidance through the night. Moments like this carried deep stillness. The sea moved slowly. The wind moved gently. The ship traveled patiently through the calm waters of the Caribbean Basin. The navigator allowed his thoughts to drift. He remembered quiet evenings beside the harbour at home. Lanterns reflecting softly upon the still water of the docks. Sometimes he and his wife would pause beside the harbour wall and watch the calm sea together. The town behind them quiet. The harbour before them peaceful beneath the stars. The memory returned softly. The ocean carried a similar peace. Evening Star continued her steady passage through the midnight waters. The wind held the sails. The sea carried the vessel forward, and the stars above watched silently as the long voyage continued through the calm hours of the night. The deepest hours of night had settled across the Caribbean Basin. The sky above the ship stretched endlessly in every direction. The stars shone quietly over the dark water, their faint reflections drifting across the surface of the sea. Evening Star continued her steady voyage. The vessel moved with patient rhythm through the warm waters. Each swell lifted the hull gently before allowing it to settle again into the calm sea. The trade winds remained steady. They moved softly through the sails, guiding the ship forward across the basin with quiet persistence. Canvas curved smoothly against the night sky. Ropes shifted along the rigging. The tall masts creaked faintly as the ship adjusted to the slow motion of the water. The navigator listened carefully. Night revealed the quiet voice of the ship. Water whispered along the hull. The sails breathed with the wind. Rope moved softly against timber high above the deck. Together these sounds formed the calm language of the voyage. Lanterns swayed slowly across the deck. Their warm glow moved gently across the wooden planks as the vessel rolled with the swells. A sailor crossed the deck carrying one of those lanterns. The light drifted across rope and sail before fading again into the shadows near the bow. The night watch continued its calm routines. Men walked the deck quietly. They listened to the wind. They studied the dark horizon where the sea stretched endlessly beneath the stars. The navigator remained near the stern rail. From there he could see the long, dark path of the ship's wake trailing behind them. The water shimmered faintly beneath the starlight before fading again into the wide basin. Above him, the constellations drifted slowly across the heavens. Sailors had trusted those distant lights for countless generations. They offered quiet guidance across the open sea. Moments like this carried a rare stillness. The sea moved slowly. The wind moved gently. The ship traveled patiently through the calm, midnight waters. The navigator allowed his thoughts to wander. He remembered the quiet harbor of his home. Lanterns reflecting softly across the still water beside the docks. Sometimes he and his wife would pause beside the harbor wall and watch the calm sea together. The town behind them silent, the harbor before them peaceful beneath the same distant stars. The memory returned softly. The ocean carried a similar calm. Evening Star continued her patient passage through the deep night sea. The wind held the sails. The water carried the hull, as the stars above watched quietly as the long voyage across the Caribbean Basin continued. The deep night continued across the Caribbean Basin. The sky above the ship remained wide and quiet. Thousands of stars shimmered gently over the dark sea. Evening Star moved steadily through the calm water. Her hull lifted slowly upon each passing swell, then settled again with quiet patience as the ship continued its long voyage. The wind remained steady in the sails. The trade winds moved softly through the canvas, guiding the vessel across the basin with calm persistence. Ropes shifted along the rigging. Wood creaked faintly within the tall masts. These small sounds travelled easily through the still night air. The navigator listened. Without the noise of daylight, the ship spoke more clearly. Water brushed along the hull with a quiet whisper. The sails breathed gently with the wind. Rope moved softly against timber high above the deck. Together these sounds formed the slow rhythm of the voyage. The sea beside the ship carried a faint glow. Occasionally small flashes of pale blue light appeared in the water. Tiny sparks that glimmered briefly before fading again into darkness. The navigator leaned slightly over the rail. The movement of the ship stirred the water below. Where the hull disturbed the surface, faint lines of light shimmered along the wake. Bioluminescent creatures drifted quietly within the basin. When disturbed, they produced a soft glow that flickered through the water like distant stars beneath the sea. Evening Star passed through these quiet lights. The wake behind the ship shimmered faintly with each slow movement of the hull. For a moment the water glowed. Then the light faded once more into the dark sea. Lanterns continued to sway along the deck. Their warm glow formed small islands of light upon the wooden planks. Each lantern moved gently with the slow motion of the ship. A sailor crossed the deck carrying one of them. The light drifted across rope and sail before disappearing into the darker shadows near the bow. The night watch continued its calm duties. Men walked the deck quietly. They listened to the wind. They studied the dark horizon where the sea stretched endlessly beneath the stars. The navigator remained near the stern rail. From that place he could see the long trail of the ship's wake, glowing faintly beneath the starlight. The basin waters moved slowly around the vessel. Above him, the constellations drifted across the heavens. Those distant lights had guided sailors across the oceans for centuries. Moments like this carried deep calm. The sea moved slowly. The wind moved gently. The ship traveled patiently through the warm, midnight waters. The navigator allowed his thoughts to wander. He remembered evenings beside the harbour at home. Lanterns reflecting softly across the still water beside the docks. Sometimes he and his wife would pause beside the harbour wall and watch the calm sea together. The town behind them quiet. The harbour before them peaceful beneath the stars. The memory returned gently. Evening Star continued her steady passage through the deep night sea. The wind held the sails. The water carried the ship forward, and the faint lights beneath the surface glimmered softly as the long voyage continued. The night sea remained calm around the ship. These were the quietest hours of the voyage. The deep middle of the night had passed, yet dawn was still far beyond the horizon. Evening Star continued her patient journey through the Caribbean Basin. The vessel moved with slow, steady rhythm. Each swell lifted the hull gently before lowering it again into the warm water. The trade winds still filled the sails. They no longer carried the warmth of the day, but they remained faithful and calm. The canvas above the deck curved smoothly against the dark sky. Ropes shifted softly along the rigging. Wood creaked faintly within the tall masts. These sounds were small and steady. The navigator listened to them carefully. Night revealed the true voice of the ship. Water whispered along the hull. The sails breathed quietly with the wind. Rope moved gently against timber high above the deck. Together these sounds formed the calm heartbeat of the voyage. Lanterns continued to glow along the deck. Their warm light moved slowly as the vessel rolled through the swells. Each lantern traced small circles of gold across the dark planks. A sailor passed quietly beneath one of them. The glow followed him across the deck before fading again into shadow near the bow. The night watch moved calmly through their duties. Men checked the sails. They listened to the wind. They studied the horizon where sea and sky merged into darkness. The navigator stood near the stern rail. From there he could see the wide basin stretching behind the ship. The wake shimmered faintly beneath the stars before fading into the still sea. Above him the constellations continued their slow movement across the heavens. For centuries sailors had watched those same lights while crossing the oceans of the world. They remained steady companions during the long hours of night. Moments like this carried deep stillness. The sea moved slowly. The wind moved gently. The ship traveled patiently through the dark basin waters. The navigator allowed his thoughts to wander. He remembered quiet nights beside the harbor of his home, lanterns reflecting softly upon the still water near the docks. Sometimes he and his wife would walk along the harbor wall and watch the calm sea together. The town behind them silent. The harbor before them peaceful beneath the same distant stars. The memory returned softly. The ocean carried a similar peace. Evening Star continued her steady voyage. Through the quiet hours before dawn, the sails held the wind. The sea carried the hull. And somewhere beyond the dark horizon, the coming morning slowly waited. The night remained deep across the Caribbean Basin. Yet somewhere beyond the distant horizon, the slow turning of the world was already preparing the coming morning. Evening Star sailed quietly through the calm water. The vessel moved with the same steady rhythm she had carried throughout the night. Each swell lifted the hull gently before allowing it to settle again into the warm sea. The trade winds remained patient. They flowed softly through the sails, guiding the ship across the basin with calm persistence. Canvas curved against the dark sky. Ropes shifted along the rigging. The tall masts creaked faintly as the vessel adjusted to the slow breathing of the sea. The navigator listened carefully. The quiet language of the ship continued around him. Water whispered along the hull. The sails breathed with the wind. Rope brushed gently against timber high above the deck. Together these sounds formed the calm rhythm of the voyage. Lanterns still glowed along the deck. Their warm light swayed slowly as the vessel rolled across the swells. Each lantern traced small circles of gold across the dark planks. A sailor crossed the deck carrying one of them. The glow drifted across rope and sail before fading once more into shadow near the bow. The night watch continued its quiet routines. Men walked the deck slowly. They checked the sails. They listened to the wind moving through the rigging. The navigator stood near the stern rail. From that place he could see the wide basin stretching behind the vessel. The ship's wake shimmered faintly beneath the stars before dissolving again into the dark water. Above him, the constellations continued their slow passage across the heavens. For generations, sailors had trusted those distant lights. They remained calm companions through the long hours of the night sea. Moments like this carried deep stillness. The sea moved slowly. The wind moved gently. The ship traveled patiently through the warm basin waters. The navigator allowed his thoughts to drift once more. He remembered quiet mornings beside the harbour at home. Sometimes before sunrise, the water there would lie perfectly still. The town remained silent. Only the faint sound of waves against the docks could be heard. He and his wife would occasionally rise early and walk beside the harbour wall while the sky slowly brightened. The memory returned gently. Evening Star continued her steady passage across the Caribbean Basin. The sails held the wind. The sea carried the hull. And somewhere beyond the dark horizon, the first faint light of morning was slowly approaching. The deep night slowly continued across the Caribbean Basin. Yet far beyond the eastern horizon, the coming morning had already begun its quiet approach. Evening Star moved steadily through the calm sea. The vessel rose gently upon the slow swells before settling again into the warm water. Her motion remained patient and steady. The trade winds continued their faithful work. They flowed softly through the sails, guiding the ship across the basin with calm persistence. Canvas curved smoothly against the fading night sky. Ropes shifted along the rigging. The tall masts creaked faintly as the vessel adjusted to the slow-breathing rhythm of the sea. The navigator listened carefully. The quiet language of the ship surrounded him. Water whispered along the hull. The sails breathed softly with the wind. Rope brushed gently against timber high above the deck. Together these sounds formed the calm rhythm of the voyage. Lanterns still swayed across the deck. Their warm light created small circles of gold upon the dark planks. Each lantern moved slowly as the vessel rolled through the swells. A sailor crossed the deck carrying one of them. The glow drifted across rope and sail before fading again near the bow. The night watch continued its quiet routines. Men checked the sails. They listened to the wind. They studied the wide, dark horizon. The navigator stood near the stern rail. From there he could see the long, dark path of the ship's wake trailing behind the vessel. The water shimmered faintly beneath the stars before dissolving again into the calm basin. Above him, the constellations slowly shifted across the sky. But low in the east, something subtle had begun to change. The sky there no longer appeared completely black. A faint softness had begun to form along the distant horizon. Not light yet, but the quiet promise of light. The navigator watched that distant edge of the sea. For sailors, the first hint of dawn was often more felt than seen. The sky gradually softened. The stars near the horizon faded one by one. The sea remained calm beneath the slowly changing heavens. Moments like this carried a peaceful stillness. The wind moved gently. The ship traveled patiently. The sea rolled slowly beneath the hull. The navigator allowed his thoughts to drift once more. He remembered mornings beside the harbour at home. The quiet hour before sunrise when the town still slept. Sometimes he and his wife would walk beside the harbour wall as the eastern sky slowly brightened above the water. The memory returned gently. Evening Star continued her steady voyage across the basin. The sails held the wind. The sea carried the ship forward. And far ahead along the eastern horizon, the first pale signs of morning slowly gathered above the Caribbean Sea. The night slowly began to loosen its hold upon the sea. Far across the eastern horizon, a faint softness had appeared in the sky. It was not yet light, but the darkness there had begun to thin. Evening Star continued her steady passage through the Caribbean Basin. The vessel rose gently upon the swells before settling again into the calm water. Her motion remained slow and patient. The trade winds still filled the sails. They moved quietly through the canvas, guiding the ship forward with calm persistence. Ropes shifted softly along the rigging. The tall masts creaked faintly as the vessel adjusted to the slow breathing rhythm of the sea. The navigator listened carefully. The quiet voice of the ship surrounded him. Water whispered along the hull. The sails breathed with the wind. Rope brushed gently against timber high above the deck. These sounds formed the steady heartbeat of the voyage. Lanterns continued to sway along the deck. Their warm glow traced small circles across the wooden planks. as the vessel rolled through the swells. A sailor crossed the deck carrying one of them. The light drifted slowly across rope and sail before fading once more into shadow near the bow. The night watch moved calmly through their duties. Men checked the sails. They listened to the wind. They studied the slowly changing horizon. The navigator looked again toward the east. The faint brightness along the horizon had grown slightly stronger. The stars nearest that distant edge had begun to fade. One by one their light softened against the slowly brightening sky. Higher above, the constellations still shone clearly, but their brilliance was no longer quite as sharp as it had been earlier in the night. The sea below remained calm. Long, slow swells rolled quietly beneath the ship. The basin waters carried the vessel forward with patient steadiness. Moments like this often brought quiet reflection. The navigator rested his hands upon the rail. He remembered early mornings beside the harbour at home. Sometimes before sunrise, the water there would lie perfectly still beneath a pale sky. The town remained silent. The first fishermen prepared their boats quietly along the docks. He and his wife would occasionally walk beside the harbour wall and watch the coming day slowly appear above the sea. The memory returned gently. Evening Star continued her steady voyage across the Caribbean Basin. The sails held the wind. The sea carried the hull. And far along the eastern horizon, the faint glow of morning slowly grew, while the final stars of night began to fade from the sky. The eastern horizon had begun to change. A faint band of pale light stretched slowly across the distant edge of the sea. The darkness that had covered the basin through the long night was beginning to soften. Evening Star sailed quietly through the calm waters. The vessel rose gently upon the slow swells before settling again into the warm sea. Her motion remained steady and patient. The trade winds continued their quiet work. They moved softly through the sails, guiding the ship forward across the basin with calm persistence. Canvas curved smoothly against the fading night sky. Ropes shifted along the rigging. The tall masts creaked faintly as the vessel adjusted to the slow-breathing rhythm of the sea. The navigator listened carefully. The quiet language of the ship surrounded him. Water whispered along the hull. The sails breathed softly with the wind. Rope brushed gently against timber high above the deck. These sounds formed the steady rhythm of the voyage. Lanterns still swayed across the deck. Their warm light moved slowly across the wooden planks as the ship rolled through the swells. A sailor crossed the deck carrying one of them. The glow drifted across rope and sail before fading again near the bow. The night watch continued their calm duties. Men checked the sails. They listened to the wind. They studied the growing light along the eastern horizon. The Navigator watched that distant edge of the sea. The faint brightness had grown stronger now. The sky no longer appeared completely dark. A pale grey light stretched upward from the horizon, slowly pushing the remaining stars higher into the sky. One by one, those stars faded. The sea below reflected the subtle change. The dark water began to soften in colour as the first light of morning touched the surface. Long, slow swells rolled quietly beneath the vessel. Moments like this carried a rare calm. The sea moved slowly. The wind moved gently. The ship travelled patiently through the quiet waters of the Caribbean Basin. The Navigator rested his hands upon the rail. He remembered early mornings beside the harbour of his home. Sometimes before sunrise the water there would lie perfectly still beneath a pale sky. The town remained silent. The first fishermen prepared their boats quietly along the docks. He and his wife would walk beside the harbour wall and watch the first light spread slowly across the sea. The memory returned softly. Evening Star continued her steady voyage across the basin. The sails held the wind. The sea carried the hull, and the pale light of dawn slowly began to rise above the Caribbean horizon. The horizon continued to brighten slowly in the east. What had once been deep darkness now carried a faint wash of pale grey light. The sea beneath the sky began to reflect that quiet change. Evening Star sailed steadily through the basin waters. The vessel rose gently upon the swells before settling again into the warm sea. Her motion remained calm and patient. The trade winds continued their quiet guidance. They moved softly through the sails, filling the canvas with steady breath. Ropes shifted along the rigging. The tall masts creaked faintly as the ship adjusted to the slow motion of the water. The Navigator listened to the ship. The quiet language of the voyage surrounded him. Water whispered along the hull. The sails breathed softly with the wind. Rope brushed gently against timber high above the deck. Together these sounds formed the steady rhythm of the journey. Lanterns still swayed across the deck. Their warm glow traced gentle arcs across the wooden planks as the vessel rolled through the swells. A sailor carried one of those lanterns across the deck. The light drifted across rope and sail before, fading once more into shadow near the bow. The night watch continued its calm routines. Men checked the sails. They listened to the wind. They studied the growing brightness along the eastern horizon. The Navigator looked toward that distant edge of the sea. The sky there had grown noticeably lighter. The final stars near the horizon had faded completely. Higher above, a few still lingered faintly in the deep blue sky. The sea itself began to reveal more detail. Where once the basin had appeared nearly black, the water now reflected subtle shades of grey and blue. Long, slow swells rolled quietly beneath the vessel. The calm rhythm of the voyage continued. Moments like this carried a gentle peace. The sea moved slowly. The wind moved softly. The ship travelled patiently through the quiet waters of the Caribbean Basin. The navigator rested his hands upon the rail. He remembered mornings beside the harbour of his home. Sometimes before sunrise the water there would lie perfectly still beneath a pale sky. The town remained quiet. Fishermen prepared their boats along the docks while the first light slowly spread across the sea. He and his wife would watch the sky brighten above the harbour water. The memory returned softly. Evening Star continued her steady voyage across the basin. The sails held the wind, the sea carried the hull, and the pale light of morning continued to grow along the eastern horizon. The first light of morning slowly rose above the eastern horizon. What had been a pale grey glow began to gather quiet colour. The sky softened into faint shades of silver and blue. Evening Star continued her steady voyage. The vessel moved calmly through the warm waters of the Caribbean Basin. Each slow swell lifted the hull before lowering it again into the sea. The trade winds still filled the sails. They moved softly through the canvas, guiding the ship forward with patient persistence. Ropes shifted quietly along the rigging. The tall masts creaked faintly as the vessel adjusted to the slow-breathing rhythm of the sea. The navigator listened to the ship. The quiet language of the voyage surrounded him. Water whispered along the hull. The sails breathed gently with the wind. Rope brushed softly against timber high above the deck. These sounds remained the steady heartbeat of the journey. Lanterns still glowed faintly across the deck, but their light now appeared softer as the sky slowly brightened. A sailor crossed the deck, carrying one of them. The warm glow drifted across rope and sail before fading once more near the bow. The night watch had nearly completed its long duty. Soon the morning watch would take their place. The navigator looked again toward the eastern horizon. The sky there continued to brighten. The last remaining stars had faded from view. The sea below reflected the growing light. Where the water had once appeared dark and endless, it now carried subtle shades of blue and grey. Long, slow swells rolled quietly beneath the ship. The basin waters moved with gentle patience. Moments like this carried a calm sense of renewal. The sea moved slowly. The wind moved softly. The ship travelled steadily through the quiet morning waters. The navigator rested his hands upon the rail. He remembered mornings beside the harbour at home, the quiet water reflecting the first light of sunrise, fishermen preparing their boats along the docks, the town slowly waking as the sky brightened above the sea. He and his wife would sometimes pause beside the harbour wall to watch the sunrise together. The memory returned gently. Evening Star continued her steady passage across the Caribbean Basin. The sails held the wind, the sea carried the hull, and the quiet light of morning slowly spread across the horizon as the voyage continued. Morning slowly spread across the Caribbean Basin. The sun had risen beyond the eastern horizon, though its light still remained soft and gentle across the wide sea. Evening Star continued her steady voyage. The vessel moved calmly through the warm waters. Each slow swell lifted the hull before lowering it again with quiet patience. The trade winds remained faithful. They flowed softly through the sails, filling the canvas with steady breath as the ship followed her long course across the basin. Ropes shifted quietly along the rigging. The tall masts creaked faintly as the vessel adjusted to the slow movement of the water. The navigator listened to the ship. The quiet language of the voyage remained unchanged. Water whispered along the hull. The sails breathed softly with the wind. Rope brushed gently against timber high above the deck. These sounds formed the steady rhythm of the journey. Lanterns along the deck had begun to fade in the growing light. Their warm glow was no longer needed as the morning sky brightened above the sea. A sailor quietly extinguished one of them near the quarterdeck. The night watch had nearly completed their long duty. Soon the morning watch would take their place. The crew moved calmly across the deck. Men checked the sails. They listened to the wind. They studied the widening horizon where the morning sky stretched above the sea. The navigator rested his hands upon the rail. The basin waters now carried gentle shades of blue and silver beneath the rising light. Long swells rolled slowly beneath the vessel. The sea remained calm. Moments like this carried a peaceful stillness. The wind moved gently. The ship travelled patiently. The sea rolled softly beneath the hull. The navigator allowed his thoughts to drift. He remembered mornings beside the harbour at home, the first sunlight touching the quiet water along the docks, fishing boats slowly leaving the harbour mouth, the town waking gently as the day began. He and his wife would sometimes walk beside the harbour wall and watch the early light spread across the sea. The memory returned softly. Evening Star continued her steady passage across the Caribbean Basin. The sails held the wind, the sea carried the hull, and the quiet morning light spread slowly across the water as the voyage continued. Morning continued to spread across the Caribbean Basin. The sky above the sea had grown brighter now, though the light remained soft and gentle across the wide water. Evening Star moved steadily forward. The vessel rose slowly upon the swells before settling again into the calm sea. Her motion remained smooth and patient. The trade winds continued their quiet work. They flowed steadily through the sails, filling the canvas with calm and reliable breath. Ropes shifted softly along the rigging. The tall masts creaked faintly as the ship adjusted to the slow motion of the basin waters. The navigator listened to the ship. The quiet language of the voyage remained steady around him. Water whispered along the hull. The sails breathed softly with the wind. Rope brushed gently against timber high above the deck. These sounds formed the familiar rhythm of the journey. The lanterns that had guided the night watch were now extinguished. Morning light had taken their place. The deck of the ship slowly brightened beneath the rising sky. A sailor moved quietly along the rail. Another inspected the lines near the forward mast. The morning watch had begun its calm routine. The navigator rested his hands upon the stern rail. From that place he could see the long basin stretching behind the vessel. The wake shimmered softly beneath the morning light before dissolving into the gentle swells. The sea itself carried new color. What had been dark water through the night now reflected shades of blue and silver beneath the growing sky. Long swells rolled slowly beneath the ship. The basin waters remained calm. Moments like this carried quiet peace. The wind moved gently. The sea moved slowly. The ship traveled patiently across the wide Caribbean Basin. The navigator allowed his thoughts to wander. He remembered mornings beside the harbor of his home, the first sunlight touching the quiet water along the docks, fishing boats leaving the harbor mouth as the town slowly woke. He and his wife would sometimes walk beside the harbor wall and watch the morning spread across the sea. The memory returned softly. Evening Star continued her steady passage across the basin. The sails held the wind. The sea carried the hull, and the calm light of morning stretched farther across the water as the voyage continued. Morning light continued to spread across the Caribbean Basin. The sky above the sea had grown brighter now, though the light remained soft and gentle across the wide water. Evening Star moved steadily forward. The vessel rose slowly upon the swells before settling again into the calm sea. Her motion remained smooth and patient. The trade winds continued their quiet guidance. They flowed softly through the sails, filling the canvas with steady breath. Ropes shifted along the rigging. The tall masts creaked faintly as the vessel adjusted to the slow breathing rhythm of the sea. The navigator listened to the ship. The quiet language of the voyage remained unchanged. Water whispered along the hull. The sails breathed softly with the wind. Rope brushed gently against timber high above the deck. These sounds formed the steady rhythm of the journey. Morning light revealed more of the sea. Where darkness had covered the basin during the night, the water now reflected calm shades of blue and silver. Long swells rolled slowly beneath the ship. The basin stretched wide in every direction. The horizon appeared clear and distant beneath the growing sky. A few sailors moved quietly across the deck. One inspected the forward sail. Another checked the lines near the main mast. The morning watch continued its calm routine. The navigator rested his hands upon the rail. From there he could see the long wake trailing behind the vessel. The water shimmered softly in the early light before dissolving again into the gentle swells. Moments like this carried a peaceful stillness. The sea moved slowly. The wind moved gently. The ship traveled patiently across the wide Caribbean Basin. The navigator allowed his thoughts to wander once more. He remembered mornings beside the harbour of his home, the quiet water reflecting the rising sun, fishing boats drifting slowly beyond the harbour mouth. He and his wife would sometimes stand beside the harbour wall and watch the calm sea together as the day began. The memory returned gently. Evening Star continued her steady passage across the basin. The sails held the wind, the sea carried the hull, and the calm morning stretched quietly across the water as the voyage continued. The morning sea stretched wide and calm around the ship. The sky above the Caribbean Basin had grown brighter, though the light remained gentle across the water. Evening Star continued her steady course. The vessel rose slowly upon the swells before settling again into the calm sea. Her motion remained smooth and patient. The trade winds flowed softly through the sails. Canvas curved against the morning sky while the ship followed her quiet path across the basin. Ropes shifted along the rigging. The tall masts creaked faintly as the vessel adjusted to the slow-breathing rhythm of the water. The navigator listened to the ship. The quiet language of the voyage remained steady. Water whispered along the hull. The sails breathed softly with the wind. Rope brushed gently against timber high above the deck. These sounds formed the calm rhythm of the journey. The sea itself carried soft color now. Shades of blue and silver stretched across the basin beneath the growing sky. Long swells rolled slowly beneath the vessel. The horizon appeared clear and distant in every direction. A small group of seabirds appeared above the water. They moved easily upon the morning wind, gliding in wide circles above the ship. One bird dipped low toward the surface before rising again. Another followed the slow path of the vessel for several moments before turning back toward the open basin. The navigator watched their quiet movement. Birds often traveled across these waters in search of fish and currents that gathered beneath the surface. Their flight added gentle motion to the wide morning sky. The crew moved calmly across the deck. A sailor checked the forward sail. Another secured a loose line near the mast. The morning watch had fully begun its quiet work. The navigator rested his hands upon the rail. From there he could see the long wake trailing behind the ship. The water shimmered softly in the morning light before dissolving into the gentle swells. Moments like this carried peaceful calm. The wind moved gently. The sea moved slowly. The ship traveled patiently across the wide Caribbean Basin. The navigator allowed his thoughts to wander. He remembered mornings beside the harbor of his home, the quiet water reflecting the rising sun, fishing boats drifting slowly beyond the harbor mouth. He and his wife would sometimes stand beside the harbor wall and watch the calm sea together as the day began. The memory returned softly. Evening Star continued her steady passage across the basin. The sails held the wind, the sea carried the hull, and the calm morning stretched quietly across the water as the voyage continued. Morning light spread calmly across the Caribbean Basin. The sky above the sea had grown bright, though the light still remained soft and gentle across the wide water. Evening Star continued her patient voyage. The vessel rose slowly upon the swells before settling again into the calm sea. Her motion remained smooth and steady. The trade winds flowed quietly through the sails. Canvas curved against the open sky, while the ship followed her long course across the basin. Ropes shifted along the rigging. The tall masts creaked faintly as the vessel adjusted to the slow breathing rhythm of the sea. The navigator listened to the ship. The quiet language of the voyage remained steady around him. Water whispered along the hull. The sails breathed softly with the wind. Rope brushed gently against timber high above the deck. These sounds formed the calm rhythm of the journey. The sea carried gentle color now, Soft blues stretched across the basin beneath the growing sky. Long swells rolled slowly beneath the vessel. The horizon remained wide and distant in every direction. A few seabirds continued to circle above the water. They moved easily upon the morning wind before gliding away toward the open basin. The crew moved calmly across the deck. One sailor inspected the forward sail. Another secured a line near the main mast. The morning watch continued its quiet routine. The navigator rested his hands upon the stern rail. From that place he could see the long wake trailing behind the vessel. The water shimmered softly beneath the morning light before dissolving into the gentle swells. Moments like this carried peaceful calm. The wind moved gently. The sea moved slowly. The ship traveled patiently across the wide Caribbean Basin. The navigator allowed his thoughts to wander once more. He remembered mornings beside the harbor of his home, the quiet water reflecting the rising sun. Fishing boats drifting slowly beyond the harbor mouth. He and his wife would sometimes stand beside the harbor wall and watch the calm sea together as the day began. The memory returned softly. Evening Star continued her steady passage across the basin. The sails held the wind. The sea carried the hull, and the calm morning stretched quietly across the water as the voyage continued. The morning sea stretched wide and calm around the ship. Soft sunlight now rested across the waters of the Caribbean Basin. The long night had passed quietly behind them. Evening Star continued her steady voyage. The vessel moved patiently through the gentle swells. Each rise of the hull was followed by a slow and peaceful settling back into the sea. The trade winds remained constant. They flowed softly through the sails, guiding the ship across the open basin with quiet reliability. Canvas curved smoothly against the morning sky. Ropes shifted gently along the rigging. The tall masts creaked faintly as the ship adjusted to the slow motion of the water. The navigator listened to these familiar sounds. The quiet language of the voyage remained unchanged. Water whispered along the hull. The sails breathed softly with the wind. Rope brushed lightly against timber high above the deck. These sounds formed the calm heartbeat of the journey. The sea itself appeared wide and endless. Soft shades of blue stretched across the basin beneath the brightening sky. Long swells rolled steadily beneath the ship. The horizon remained clear in every direction. The crew moved quietly across the deck. A sailor checked the lines near the forward mast. Another adjusted the position of a sail to catch the wind more fully. Their work remained calm and steady. The navigator rested his hands upon the stern rail. From that place he could see the long wake trailing behind the vessel. The water shimmered softly beneath the morning light before dissolving again into the slow swells. Moments like this carried quiet reflection. The wind moved gently. The sea moved slowly. The ship traveled patiently across the Caribbean Basin. The navigator allowed his thoughts to drift once more. He remembered peaceful mornings beside the harbor at home, the quiet water reflecting the rising sun, fishing boats drifting slowly beyond the harbor mouth. He and his wife would sometimes stand beside the harbor wall and watch the calm sea together as the day began. The memory returned softly. Evening Star continued her steady passage across the basin. The sails held the wind. The sea carried the hull. And the quiet voyage across the Caribbean waters continued beneath the growing morning sky. Morning had fully arrived upon the Caribbean Basin. Soft sunlight now stretched across the wide sea. The long quiet night had passed gently into the calm of a new day. Evening Star continued her steady course. The vessel moved patiently through the slow swells. Each rise of the hull was followed by a quiet settling back into the water. The trade winds remained constant. They moved softly through the sails, guiding the ship across the open basin with calm persistence. Canvas curved smoothly against the brightening sky. Ropes shifted along the rigging. The tall masts creaked faintly as the vessel adjusted to the slow-breathing rhythm of the sea. The navigator listened to the ship. The quiet language of the voyage remained steady around him. Water whispered along the hull. The sails breathed gently with the wind. Rope brushed lightly against timber high above the deck. These sounds formed the calm rhythm of the journey. The sea stretched wide in every direction. Soft shades of blue rolled across the basin beneath the morning sky. Long swells moved slowly beneath the vessel. The horizon remained distant and clear. The crew continued their quiet duties. A sailor adjusted a line near the main mast. Another studied the sails as they filled with wind. Their work carried the calm routine of a long voyage. The navigator rested his hands upon the rail. From there he could see the long wake trailing behind the ship. The water shimmered softly beneath the morning light before dissolving into the gentle swell. Moments like this carried quiet peace. The wind moved steadily. The sea moved slowly. The ship traveled patiently across the Caribbean Basin. The navigator allowed his thoughts to wander once more. He remembered peaceful mornings beside the harbor of his home, the quiet water reflecting the rising sun, fishing boats drifting slowly beyond the harbor mouth. He and his wife would sometimes stand beside the harbor wall and watch the calm sea together as the day began. The memory returned softly. Evening Star continued her steady passage across the basin. The sails held the wind. The sea carried the hull. And far ahead across the bright morning waters, the voyage quietly continued. The morning sea extended quietly in every direction. Soft sunlight rested across the waters of the Caribbean Basin, spreading gentle color across the wide horizon. Evening Star continued her steady voyage. The vessel moved slowly through the swells, rising and settling with patient rhythm. Each movement of the hull followed the calm breathing of the sea. The trade winds remained steady companions. They flowed softly through the sails, filling the canvas with quiet strength. The sails curved gracefully above the deck. Their fabric shifted gently as the wind moved through them, guiding the ship across the basin waters. Ropes moved quietly along the rigging. The tall masts creaked faintly as the vessel adjusted to the slow motion of the sea below. The navigator listened to these familiar sounds. Water moved softly along the hull. The sails breathed with the wind. Rope brushed gently against timber high above the deck. Together, these sounds formed the calm rhythm of the voyage. The sea stretched wide and open. Long swells rolled steadily beneath the ship. Each swell lifted the vessel before lowering it again into the quiet basin waters. Far across the horizon, the morning sky appeared clear. Soft shades of blue spread slowly above the sea. The navigator rested his hands upon the stern rail. From that place he could see the long path of water trailing behind the vessel. The wake shimmered briefly beneath the sunlight before dissolving again into the gentle swells. A few seabirds drifted across the distant sky. They moved easily upon the wind before gliding down toward the open water. One bird circled the vessel once before turning back toward the wide basin. The crew continued their quiet work across the deck. A sailor inspected the forward lines. Another adjusted the sail slightly so the canvas could better capture the wind. Their movements were calm and practiced. The navigator watched the sea ahead. The voyage continued steadily. The wind carried the ship forward. The sea lifted and lowered the hull. The wide basin stretched endlessly toward the horizon. Moments like this carried deep stillness. The wind moved gently. The sea moved slowly. The ship traveled patiently across the morning waters. The navigator allowed his thoughts to drift. He remembered peaceful mornings beside the harbor of his home, the quiet water reflecting the rising sun. Fishing boats leaving the harbor mouth while the town slowly woke behind them. Sometimes he and his wife would walk beside the harbor wall together. They would watch the sunlight spread across the sea. The memory returned softly. Evening Star continued her steady passage across the Caribbean Basin. The sails held the wind. The sea carried the hull. And far ahead across the calm waters, the voyage continued toward distant horizons. Morning continued quietly across the Caribbean Basin. The sea stretched wide and calm beneath the gentle sky. Soft sunlight rested across the long swells as they moved steadily beneath the ship. Evening Star continued her patient voyage. The vessel rose and settled with the slow breathing of the water. Each motion carried the quiet rhythm of the open sea. The trade winds moved faithfully through the sails. Canvas curved above the deck, while the ship followed her long path across the basin. Ropes shifted softly along the rigging. The tall masts creaked faintly as the vessel adjusted to the slow movement of the swells. The navigator listened to the ship. Water whispered along the hull. The sails breathed gently with the wind. Rope brushed lightly against timber high above the deck. These sounds had become the steady language of the voyage. He rested his hands upon the stern rail and watched the morning sea. Moments like this often invited quiet reflection. Sometimes during the long passages between landfalls, he would write letters home. Not long reports of the voyage, but small notes about the sea and the places he had seen. He imagined sitting at a small table near the cabin window, the ship rocking gently while ink moved slowly across the page. The words might begin simply. "My dear Margaret, this morning the sea is calm and wide around us. The ship sails well, and the wind carries us steadily across these warm waters." He would describe the quiet sounds of the voyage, the movement of the sails, the slow rhythm of the swells, the distant birds gliding above the basin. Sometimes he would write of the night sky, of the constellations that guided the ship across the ocean. He imagined how she might read those letters at home, perhaps beside the window of their small house, or walking slowly beside the harbour wall where they often watched the sea together. He could picture her pausing to look toward the horizon while reading his words. The memory brought a quiet warmth. Far from home though he travelled, the sea often carried those memories back to him. Evening Star continued forward across the basin. The sails held the wind. The sea lifted the hull and lowered it again with patient rhythm. The crew moved calmly across the deck. The voyage continued, and somewhere far beyond the horizon, the harbour of home waited quietly for the ship's eventual return. Morning light rested gently across the Caribbean Basin. The sea moved with slow and steady rhythm beneath the hull of Evening Star. Long swells rolled across the open water, while the ship followed her patient course. The trade winds continued their faithful work. They moved softly through the sails, filling the canvas with calm strength and guiding the vessel forward across the basin. Ropes shifted quietly along the rigging. The tall masts creaked faintly as the ship adjusted to the slow-breathing motion of the sea. The navigator stood near the quarterdeck rail. From there he could see the wide horizon stretching across the morning waters. The basin appeared endless beneath the clear sky. A few seabirds glided across the distant air before drifting away toward the open sea. The crew continued their quiet work across the deck. One sailor adjusted a line near the forward mast. Another checked the sail as the wind moved through the canvas. Their movements remained calm and practiced. The captain stepped quietly beside the navigator. For several moments neither man spoke. They simply watched the sea. The swells moved steadily beneath the ship. The wind carried the sails forward. Finally, the captain rested his hands upon the rail. "She holds her course well," he said quietly. The navigator nodded. "Evening Star has proven to be a sturdy and capable ship," he replied. The captain looked across the horizon. "These waters are calmer than the Atlantic crossing," he said. "The basin welcomes us kindly." The navigator watched the slow movement of the swells. "The sea often rewards patience," he said softly. "Ships that travel with the wind instead of against it usually find calmer passages." The captain smiled faintly at those words. He understood the meaning behind them. A good voyage required careful judgment and steady leadership. The ship depended upon the captain's decisions. The navigator's role was simply to offer quiet guidance when needed. They stood together for a moment longer. The wind moved gently through the sails. Water whispered along the hull. The steady sounds of the voyage surrounded them. The captain nodded once more. "She will carry us well," he said. Then he returned quietly to his duties among the crew. The navigator remained at the rail. Evening Star continued her steady passage across the Caribbean Basin. The sails held the wind. The sea lifted the hull and lowered it again with calm patience. The wide morning stretched peacefully across the water as the voyage continued. The morning sea stretched wide and calm around the ship. Soft sunlight rested across the waters of the Caribbean Basin. Long swells rolled steadily beneath the hull of Evening Star as she continued her patient voyage. The trade winds moved gently through the sails. Canvas curved high above the deck, while the ship followed her quiet course across the open basin. Ropes shifted softly along the rigging. The tall masts creaked faintly as the vessel adjusted to the slow rhythm of the sea. The navigator stood once more near the stern rail. From that place he could see the long wake trailing behind the ship. The water shimmered briefly in the sunlight before dissolving again into the steady swells. The basin stretched endlessly in every direction. The horizon formed a long quiet circle where the sky met the sea. A few seabirds glided across the distant air before drifting away toward the open water. The crew continued their calm routines across the deck. A sailor inspected the forward lines. Another adjusted the sail slightly so the wind filled the canvas more evenly. Their movements remained slow and practiced, the steady work of a well-kept ship. Evening Star moved patiently through the basin waters. The sea lifted the hull, then lowered it again. Each movement followed the gentle breathing of the ocean. The wind remained soft. The swells rolled calmly. The voyage continued. Moments like this carried a deep quiet. The sea moved slowly. The wind moved gently. The ship travelled patiently across the morning waters. The navigator rested his hands upon the rail and allowed his thoughts to drift. He remembered the harbour at home, the stone wall where he and his wife often walked beside the water. Sometimes they would pause there together and watch the slow movement of the tide beneath the rising sun. The harbour would remain quiet at that early hour. Only the sound of water against the docks and the distant movement of fishing boats leaving for the day. Those peaceful mornings had always carried a sense of calm. The sea often felt the same, even far from home, even across the wide basin. Evening Star continued forward. The sails held the wind. The sea carried the hull. And far ahead across the calm waters of the Caribbean Basin, the voyage quietly continued. Beneath the open morning sky, the sea continued to roll gently beneath the ship. Evening Star moved patiently across the calm waters of the Caribbean Basin. The wind filled the sails. The hull rose and settled slowly with each passing swell. The wide horizon stretched quietly around the vessel. Soft sunlight rested across the open sea. Water whispered along the hull. Ropes shifted softly along the rigging. The tall masts creaked faintly as the ship followed her steady course. The crew continued their quiet work across the deck. The voyage moved forward calmly. The navigator rested his hands upon the rail and looked out across the wide morning waters. The sea carried the ship onward. The wind guided the sails, and the long journey across the Caribbean Basin continued quietly. beneath the open sky.